All right. Hi, I'm Rosie Le Faive. My pronouns are they or she. This is going to be a real rundown of everything I could think of to write about taxonomies. Just checking the chat. Okay. So there's going to be a lot of talking, a lot of trying not to read the slides. There will be time afterwards for questions, and also feel free to just pipe up. I won't be monitoring the chat as I'm going, so just unmute yourself and say, hey, if you have something that you want to ask, if something is unclear. So this is going to be kind of starting from the very basics and going up to what I think like the latest things that I've learned about taxonomies in using them in Islandora. So our plan for the day is to talk about what is taxonomy, how taxonomy terms are special, what we do when we're using taxonomy terms, how we interact with them, a bit of a more administrative thing, how you manage vocabularies, how vocabularies and terms work in Islandora. And then as a bonus, we'll talk about using entity reference views as a reference method. And some of the content in here I've marked off with a little graduation cap just to say this is more technical or academic. Don't worry if it doesn't make sense. So to start with, we'll talk about taxonomy in Drupal. And the word taxonomy is kind of vague. It probably means one of two other things. So this is a bit of a vocabulary rundown to overload the word vocabulary. So the first term is taxonomy term, which usually means an individual term in a vocabulary. But it can also mean the category of all taxonomy terms. When it's used this way, we say it's an entity type. Drupal has lots of entities. Nodes are entities, users are entities, taxonomies are entities. So a taxonomy term is an entity type. And then as an example, the string Montgomery LM Lucy Maud 1874 to 1942 is, well, technically it's the name of a taxonomy term. And then you could say the genre field is a taxonomy term reference field. And then a vocabulary is an ordered list of taxonomy terms that are grouped together. So it also defines what fields a taxonomy term can have. Technically, if taxonomy term, as we just said, was an entity type, then this is an entity subtype, or as they call it in Drupal, a bundle. So the Montgomery LM Lucy Maud taxonomy term is in the person vocabulary. So taxonomy stuff lives under the structure, so under the manage bar on the very top, under structure and under taxonomy. It is part of Drupal core, so you probably already have this enabled and available in your site. If you don't, because you're experimenting with the minimal install profile or something, then you might need to go to extend and find the module taxonomy under core and enable it, but usually it comes enabled. So here's a screenshot of the taxonomy landing page where you see your list of vocabularies, and we've got corporate body and country. Then once you click on one of those, so we clicked on resource types, that's our vocabulary, you get a listing of the taxonomy terms. And usefully, you can see that these are organized in some sort of hierarchy, and they also can be organized up and down, so in terms of weight. So there are, you can have additional fields on taxonomy terms. The first thing that all taxonomy terms have is a name. It's mandatory. You can't have a term without a name. That's how it shows up everywhere. It's its label. It's not really a field. It's kind of like the way title for nodes is not really a field. It's built in. It's more like a property. You have to have something in there. But taxonomy terms can have additional fields. So you go to the vocabulary to configure all this. So the vocabulary person has all these extra fields, alternate name, authority sources, etc. And they can be different field types as well. So what's special about vocabularies and taxonomy terms? The first thing is hierarchy. So both an ordering, like you can drag and drop the terms to reorder how they appear. However, this really doesn't show up to users very well. They can't access the taxonomy term overview page, which we just saw where we saw the list of terms. But if you want to organize that for yourself, that's great. And vocabularies can have hierarchy, so you can nest terms underneath each other. In the resource type Library of Congress resource type vocabulary, we've got terms for audio, audio musical, and audio non-musical, and the latter two are nested underneath the former. So some tips about using hierarchy. When you're using a term, you might actually want to categorize it underneath two different parents, but you cannot do that in vocabularies. We'll go into this a little bit later, but if you're using hierarchy and you want to show all the things with audio, but you want to include audio musical and audio non-musical, then you need to use the filter has taxonomy term with depth in your view. And hierarchy is really cool because it provides Drupal breadcrumbs right out of the box. So here's an example of a taxonomy term landing page. This is the term page for Albertan PEI. And here you can see it starts with home, but we've kind of cut that off. North America, Canada, Maritime Provinces, etc., down to Lot 4, which is the parent term for Albertan. And so this can be displayed just by organizing those things into a hierarchy. So let's talk a little more about this taxonomy term landing page. By default, it's going to be at your site URL /taxonomy/term/the term ID. So this is what it might look like. This page is populated via view, and even the page is created by a view. So you can go into views and edit it if you want to. You can disable the one that came with Drupal, and you can make your own if you like. But out of the box, the basic view shows the term name and whatever fields you've configured to display. So we've configured to display the authority link where you can head out to GeoNames to see Albertan. And then we've also shown a geofield field, or I think it's a geolocation field. Anyway, shows Albertan on a map. And then if we were to scroll down, we would see the content, i.e. the nodes that are tagged with this term. By default, again, it doesn't show the child term, so you need to change the taxonomies, or so you have to change the view's contextual filter to taxonomy term with depth. And because of the way that views works, you need to choose what entity type you want to show. And so the taxonomy term view shows content, which means it's never going to show you media, which means if you go to the original file term, even though you might have hundreds of media tagged with that term, nothing is going to show on the taxonomy terms page because it's only looking for content, i.e. nodes. So here's a zoomed out version of the Charlottetown showing the field, the map, and then these are our Islandora objects. So we just have two showing real life superheroes and looking backwards. So when you want to use taxonomy terms, you probably want to add a taxonomy term field. And this is the new Drupal 10.2 interface for when you are adding a field. So first you'll choose like a content type like Islandora object or article, and then click add a field. You'll have to put in a label, and then you need to choose the reference field type. These are now categories. There used to be a drop-down list where you could see taxonomy term on the top level, but now you have to kind of drill down. So click on reference, and then below, I didn't have space to show the entire form. So all the way at the bottom, these options show up, and you can choose taxonomy term from there. The other way to use taxonomy terms is with the typed relation field. So this is a special field type written for Islandora-ish, and it's part of the controlled access terms module. It allows you to have kind of a double-barreled field where you have your taxonomy term, like Jim Hornby with term ID 938, and a relationship type. So we've got editor selected right now, and these are all configurable in the field. So this is an extension of the reference field type. We just saw like you made the reference taxonomy type, and this is going to be the typed relation taxonomy field type. So when you're configuring your taxonomy term field, your reference field, in the field settings, you have a lot of stuff that you can configure. The first important thing is how many values you want to allow, whether it's limited or unlimited. And if it's limited, how many do you want to allow? There's always a spot for help text, and I always want to say, please enter help text. It really assists anybody adding metadata or trying to figure out what kind of parameters the content of this field should fall under. It's very useful. And then if you scroll down, again, I had to do some magic there. You can select the reference type, and by default, you will have default selected. But there is an option for entity reference view, which we'll talk about like at the end of the presentation if we have time. There's a button here to create the reference entities if they don't exist. And so this is how you have it work, kind of like free tagging. You can just type whatever you want in there. And if it's not in the vocabulary, it'll create a new term. You can then select which vocabularies you want to vocabularies you want to use. If you have multiple vocabularies selected, then you will also need to select which vocabulary to put new terms in, because they can only go into one of them. All right, so this part is going to be about the field formatters and display formatters that taxonomy terms can use. So if you go into manage display or manage form display, excuse me, on, for instance, the repository item, you can choose one of these 4 different display formatters for your taxonomy term field. So you can use a select list, and it just looks like a drop down, and then these little dashes show the hierarchy. Oh, and this is probably actually showing it in the order in which the that you've dragged it into in the vocabulary listing of the terms. It will look a little bit different if you have multiple selections allowed. So that would, instead of being a drop down, it would look like a bigger select box, and you could control click to select multiple. Or you could choose checkboxes / radio buttons. So the radio buttons if you've allowed 1, and checkboxes if you've allowed more. And then you can try these 2, which seem really similar if you're only allowed 1 term, but they look very different if they have multiple terms. So the autocomplete has every term in its own little box, and autocomplete's tags style has 1 box, and you can start typing terms in autocomplete with them, and it adds a comma between them. So I also want to mention this number that shows up in parentheses, because this is really important when you're using taxonomy terms. Make sure that you select the term from the dropdown when you see it. If you don't, then you won't have this number, which is the term ID, in brackets after the field name. This really ensures that you're linking to an actual term, and if you don't do that, you might end up with a duplicate term in your vocabulary. Or end up with a typo or other things. So really make sure that you click on the dropdown to select from the autocomplete what term you want. All right, if you're using, that was all for the standard Drupal reference taxonomy field. But if you're using typed relation, you only have 1 widget to work with. And for this, it's an autocomplete. It only allows 1 value because the term only allows 1 taxonomy, the field only allows 1 term per instance of that thing. And you'll need to choose a different relationship type if you have multiple of them. So that's called the type relation widget. And then under display, so that was in the form how you show it to editors, but this is how it'll display to your site visitors. You can select what kind of thing you want to display, whether it's the label, which is, I think, the most common, and there's an option under this little gear, and it shows here to link to the referenced entity. You can show the entity ID, although you normally don't use that for display. That's something that you're like going to act on programmatically. You can show a rendered entity if you want to show more fields, or you can use RSS category and children entity count. I'm not honestly sure how that would work in the normal use of field display. If you're using typed relation, there are 2 options that you have: the typed relation formatter and the typed relation dedupe formatter. So if you have the typed relation formatter, you might have multiple, one person like Jim Hornby here with multiple roles. But if you use the dedupe formatter, it will combine those into one line. All right, so managing vocabularies. There are a few useful tools that you can use for that, and some of these, including these ones here, are included in the starter site. So Taxonomy Manager is a contrib module that lets you, it's a different interface for managing your vocabularies. It looks like this. You access it at Structure, Taxonomy Manager, so right below Taxonomy. And when you select one of these terms from the list, it populates the term form in the right-hand pane. So you can edit all the fields there and you can save at the bottom. And you can also select some of these and delete them. You can add terms just by pasting in a list of term names. So it's pretty cool, but it does really prioritize the term name as the main thing that you want to do, especially if you want to add terms. You can only add the term names. It'll leave the rest of the fields blank. And you can also export them. Again, it'll just export the term names, but it will export them with the hierarchy if you have that. And the other module that's really useful is called Term Merge. Again, it's a contrib module and it's in the starter site. You access it if you go to Structure, Taxonomy, choose a vocabulary, and then click the Merge tab. Be really careful with it because the interface lies to you. So it says terms to merge on the first step, but what it really needs you to select is the terms that you don't want. So here I can see Alberta in the country vocabulary, and that's because this is the mark country vocabulary, and being Anglo-American centric, they put Canadian and US provinces and states as top level entities here. So say I wanted to remove Alberta or merge it in with and under Canada, I would select Alberta. And then on the second page, it'll ask me, where do you want to merge them into? And there is where I will select Canada. This only works if the terms are in the same vocabulary, and it will do a really useful thing of updating taxonomy reference fields to point to the preferred term. So anytime I had, a geographic subject, or sorry, I don't know, I don't remember the field, what it's called, but the field that uses the mark country of Alberta, it would change it over to Canada. This is the part where I feel bad for putting this in a small bullet point, so I highlighted it so I don't do death by PowerPoint. But this does not work on type relation fields. It will merge the terms, but it will not update the references. So you have ghost references. And this is a little digression that I got into. This is not an official term. I'm just calling them ghost references because that seems to make sense. But if you delete a taxonomy term that's being used by content, then you will probably end up with what I'm calling ghost references. In the node, it still points to the term, like say I deleted term 4, the node will still say, I'm pointing to term 4, even though it doesn't actually exist. So you can see it. This is bad. This is like no referential integrity, bad for databases, bad for you, bad for your metadata, right? If you want to see it, you can append !_format equals JSON to the node URL. Notice this is JSON, not JSON LD, which you might be used to going to see the RDF version of your node. This format equals JSON shows you like the Drupal structure of your node. And it's the closest way you have to like peer into the database of what Drupal thinks this entity is. And yeah, if you have ghost references, you probably want to fix them either through Workbench or Migrate or a script or something. I have some stuff on the following slide to help you find the nodes with the specific term IDs in specific fields. If you have ghost references and you go into the form to edit the node, you might accidentally delete that ghost reference, which might be bad because you might have wanted to go in there and find them and fix them and update them. If you don't care about the ghost references, that's fine. So here's what it looks like in JSON. So you go to all that format equals JSON stuff, and then scroll down to field resource type was the particular field that I had deleted a term from. And then you can see the target ID still equals 4, even though 4 doesn't exist. This is really hard to get to because if you're trying to display something in a view or display something in the interface, it generally tries to load the term and then display it. And so if it can't load the term, it displays nothing. So it looks like it's not there. That's why it's really hard to find. And most filtering in views, again, tries to load the entity. So how to find ghost references? Use a contextual filter and select the filter that's specific to the field. So this is the contextual filter for field resource type. Using the field agnostic filters like has taxonomy term ID are not going to work. And then once you've got this as a contextual filter, you add that term ID to the view's path as another path parameter. Path component. So that 4 at the end of the URL is our contextual filter, i.e. the term ID. And then here it'll show this book, Wildflowers Western Canada from the Sandbox, which is the one that has the ghost reference. And again, it's type ID. I was trying to display it here, but the type links to a non-existent term, so it doesn't display anything, but it is in fact linked to term 4. All right, back to our regularly scheduled taxonomy terms. You can't move terms between vocabularies. Similarly to how you cannot move nodes between content types, but with terms, it can be really frustrating, especially if you have a lot of names and you might have put some corporate names into person or vice versa or things like that. So just be very careful when you're creating terms, and you can do round tripping using Workbench or whatever you want to use to edit your Drupal data to make a new term that replaces the old term, and then go in and update all the existing references to point to the new term. So a few different ways that you can, a few different tools that you can use to do maintenance on your taxonomy terms. You can just use the Drupal interface to do them one by one. Sometimes that is the best way to go about it if it needs a lot of individual attention. You can use views bulk edit, which is great for setting fields to a common value. So suppose you have a new field that you want for all this vocabulary to set it to the same value, you can do that using views bulk edit. You can also publish or unpublish or delete terms using views bulk edit. And this is a plugin for views that uses the views bulk edit module. Islandora Workbench. If you're not familiar with it, it is an amazing Python command line tool for updating your Islandora stuff. It has two tasks, create terms and update terms, which work for vocabularies. It doesn't delete, to my knowledge. Drupal Migrate is another tool. It's core Drupal, or it's part of Drupal, and it does require some editing of YAML files. I find it a little bit, I'm not as used to it as I am used to Workbench, but it is, a functionally equivalent alternative. And it can create and update any entity, not just terms. And then another thing that you can use is Drush, which stands for the Drupal shell. It's a command line tool for doing anything with Drupal. And it's really good for deleting terms. It's something like you can run SQL in Drush and delete from things or delete terms that way. So vocabularies and terms in Islandora. And here's where we get more into the starter site stuff. So this is a list of the vocabularies that we've put in the starter site. Tags was like a basic Drupal one, so kind of ignore it. It's not as relevant to Drupal. It's not as relevant to Islandora. But the rest of these are the ones that you might be using. I've labeled Islandora display, media use, and models as kind of structural vocabularies because they really work differently than the other ones. They're about how to present the object, how the object is structured, and what the different parts of an object do. And not all of the vocabularies in the starter site come pre-populated, but the ones that are highlighted in yellow do. And so we try to do that just to provide a really easy out of the box, again, like kind of Library of Congress centric-ish view of things. So you've got your, publication frequencies, if that's important to you. The country of publication, again, that's using the Library of Congress country, which includes provinces and states. And we populate some resource types, both from the Dublin Core Metadata Initiative and from the Library of Congress. And so those are two different vocabularies, and they have a little bit of overlap between the terms. So if you're using them, be careful at the moment. I think I have a pull request open to work on getting the duplicate terms working properly. All right, and we have a couple of special term fields that are special to Islandora. So the first one is called authority sources, and you might see this in some of the vocabularies like person and corporate body and subject. So this is another special field type defined by controlled access terms. It is a link field plus the select list. So it's kind of a different flavor of the typed relation field, where it's kind of a typed link, if you will. These types are configurable per field, and it's often, heuristically, it seems to be used most when this URI is an authority record. So whether that's VIAF or the Library of Congress subject headings or any other, or geonames perhaps, or other authority files. And then the other one is field external link. This is just a link field, but its machine name needs to be field underscore external underscore link. And if its machine name is exactly this, then it's hard coded to act in a certain way, which we'll get to in a second. So it's almost, I think it's usually single valued. And this is kind of a weird nuance that if you've done cataloging, it might ring a bell for you. But this is usually used when the link is to a linked data URI, so a real world object URI, as opposed to an authority record. And the distinction between those things, I'm not always 100% clear on, but it does exist. We do put those things into different fields in MARC. So it makes sense that they're kind of differently treated in Islandora. Okay, now I want to explain this Islandora-ism, which is term with URI. So if we want to say, like on the top here of this diagram, that my node is a schema.org/book, and is kind of read that a little bit more generically than strict RDF, like has type schema.org/book. So this node is described by this URI somehow. That's what we want. That's our goal. That's what we're trying to get to. But how we do this in Islandora is with an intermediate taxonomy term. So our node has a field which points to a taxonomy term, which itself has a field that points to the string schema.org/book. And so when we have things this way, we say a node has a term with a URI. So this takes advantage of Drupal's taxonomy features. It allows us to autocomplete things a lot better, so there's fewer typos. It's easier to control who can make new values, so you can control the list of allowed terms. And it's more robust than using this, having a URI is more robust than referring to the term ID if you want to be able to share your configuration between different sites. So for instance, the taxonomy term paged content has external URI, that field we were just talking about, a value of schema.org/book. What field does it have to be an external, or to be a URI? It could either be the external link field, like machine name field external link, or any field, oh, I shouldn't have had that there, any field that is an authority source field. So this appears mostly in contexts. When you use one of these three, media has term with URI, node has term with URI, or parent node for media has term with URI. These are context conditions that you can use to make, the site display and behave how you want it to. These are field agnostic. So it doesn't matter what field on the node the term is in, as long as the term is attached to the node. And so you can enter terms here. Again, it's a tags style autocomplete. And even though you don't see the external URI, what's actually happening behind the scenes when it saves this context is that it's recording the URI of the page content term. And the only terms that will appear in this autocomplete are terms that have an external URI or authority source. So I think that this is a really interesting way that Islandora has chosen to be able to talk about our content using taxonomy terms to be that link between the thing and the URI. It allows us to do a lot of like this context stuff, use views to filter down things, and have it in a way that's like linked data friendly. And yeah. All right. Another spiel that I wanted to give was about taxonomy terms versus authority records. So when you're making taxonomy, when you're entering content into Drupal and you're in a taxonomy term field, you want to enter a value and you have no choice but to create a taxonomy term for that value. Once you've done that, you end up with this vocabulary of terms, and they kind of remind you of like authority records because it's a separate database table for one thing. And they behave as though they are controlled terms. But in practice, a real authority record takes an awful lot of authority work. So somebody, usually a librarian, will very carefully check this name against other relevant databases, do some disambiguation to make sure it's the right person, determine the most common form of name, and then follow a whole bunch of very precise rules in how to construct an authorized access point. And that's what goes into an authority record. Usually in an ILS, you have the option, and it might depend on your policy, of just entering a more unstructured description and not linking it to an authority record, like not saying that this is the authorized term, so it doesn't, clutter up your authority records. But in Drupal, that kind of happens automatically. You end up, if you're allowing people to create their own terms, you're going to end up with something that needs maintenance, with a vocabulary that needs maintenance. So how can you disambiguate between terms that have been authorized, if that's something that you do, and you might want to do that? You could either have it linked to an authority record in its authority sources field, or you could implement a checkbox to say, this term has been locally authorized. I want you to use it. And then you might need to do different things to have those come up in the interface differently. But that's all very possible, and I'm sure there are many other ways that you could do this. But taxonomy terms are not equivalent to authority records. Just wanted to put that out there. Terms in views. So you can do some really powerful filtering in views and make relationships to terms. There are also 3 contextual filters that are really important. And the cool thing about them is that they are field agnostic. So no matter what field this term is, if it's tagged with a term, then it'll show up under these filters. And these filters work both with typed relation fields as well as basic taxonomy term fields. So that's really awesome. All right, what's our time? Oh, good. Here's what I would have called the bonus, showing how entity reference views can work as a reference method. So when you're setting up your taxonomy term as a field, there was that reference method dropdown where you could choose between default or views filtered by an entity reference view. So first you need to make an entity reference view, and that is a view with an entity reference display. So, you've got your page display, your block display, your REST export display, and entity reference is another display there. So it needs to have one of those. And then the view is I'm gonna show a slide, a screenshot of this in a second. The view dictates what gets searched and how the autocomplete displays. And it's also in charge of filtering by what things are allowed. So here's an example of autocomplete with a entity reference view populating the autocomplete. So if I type in UPEI, but the actual taxonomy term is University of Prince Edward Island, my view shows the term name, a hyphen, the vocabulary name, and then any alternate names that the term has. So I had to go into University of Prince Edward Island and add an alternate name for this to work. But this allows it, I've also configured that it can search, searches on that alternate name field, which is probably something that you want to do if you're using the alternate name field. And so once you click on it, it scrunches everything up into one line, so it's not super pretty, but it does say the term ID there, term 940. This stuff is not part of the actual term. It just shows up there in the autocomplete, unfortunately. So to conclude, there are another couple of videos that are relevant to this. If you wanted to update some linked agent fields, so exporting the names that you have in your database, in your site, and then into a spreadsheet, and then transforming that spreadsheet or turning it into a couple of workbench tasks to fix problems that you had with those names in bulk using Workbench. You can check out this pair of videos that I released a few months ago. And these are from the metadata interest group. All right. That concludes the scripted portion of this. So are there any questions? I'm reading the comments. Mark, Firefox formats JSON so humans can read it, but Chrome does not. But there's an extension you can install. Thank you. That would be really useful to know. Yeah.
Hello, this is Cara from Wellesley College. I had a question about, is there any future development that we know of for Islandora for adding like alternative names to like taxonomies? So if you had, I don't know, a middle name and, you know, someone put a middle name or not, but it would still refer to the same taxonomy term, sort of like an authority record, but I don't know.
Yeah, well, there are two things that I wanted to point out. One of them is that right now, if you go to person, and you edit somebody, scroll down, there is an alternate name field already in Islandora. So you can add like a Drupal.org handle if you want.
And is that something that can be added in Workbench?
Yes, I believe so, because if you're using the create terms or update terms tasks, if I remember correctly, they allow you to add stuff to fields on the terms as well. So you would just point to the alternate name field in your column.
Okay.
Yeah, that's correct. The thing to keep in mind is you can add any field of data to a taxonomy term using the create terms task. But in the create task, which is where you're creating nodes and just adding terms in your CSV, you can't do that. You can only Workbench can only create the term if the term only has a name.
So if it matched an alternative name, then it would create a new taxonomy term instead.
That's correct. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So I guess I would summarize it to say any taxonomy. So just to make sure I use the right language, I think Drupal uses the word vocabulary to mean the set of terms in one that are related in one group. Taxonomy term is the individual term. I think that's correct, but it's confusing for sure. Anyway, so you can, if you want to add a taxonomy entry, like a taxonomy term entry, with more than the basic fields, and any of those fields are required, you need to use a create terms task to add them in advance. You can't add them at the same time, like on the fly when creating new nodes. When creating new nodes, you can only add basically the term name.
Yeah, this is our hosting company did our taxonomy term ingest for us, so we didn't see that part, but that all sounds very familiar for what they told us.
Yeah. Yeah, as I was saying earlier on, I guess we could make Workbench do that, but the CSV would be so gnarly that it would be hard to create and manage, because you need to add that structure. Yeah.
You can use the update terms task though, to add alternate names to existing terms.
Yeah, that's true. But I think the question, Kara, is that can you use that alternate name in your input CSV when you're creating nodes? Yeah, no.
Yeah,
you can't do that. Yeah. Yeah, you could work around it if you wanted to create a special view that would give you, like, if you there's a way to work around it, but it's fairly complex. Maybe we could explore that if you want, but it's you'd have to create a special view that would give you back let you query the vocabulary by any field you want, and then get back the entire record and then vocabulary term record, and then use that to, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, it's right now I struggle. I just did our theses ingest for this year, and it was all like very manual labor, like standardizing the names of the professors because the students self-submit the forms, and it's just a big mess. So we're trying to do our own sort of standardization of names, but it would be nice if there was a easier way to put in all the forms of someone's names that the students use a lot. But yeah, anyway.
Interesting.
Huh.
Yeah, I recognize the problem. Workbench just doesn't do it at the moment, but we could explore it and see what we can come up with. I just think the solution would be fairly complex, but we could, not to say we shouldn't do it.
Thank you.
It did. I mean, this is also super complex. It just popped into my head, and I think I understand your problem. But is there like I hate to suggest it, but if the primary reason is to make searchability happen with that alternate versions of the names, I mean, could an option be to load as is and then try to remediate after? Would that be simpler than trying to make Workbench understand all those variants? I know the merge isn't totally ideal, but I guess it depends on how many you're loading and how many variants there are and how hard they are to realign.
Yeah.
But that would be like, because you could do a view, presumably, that would show you those and then potentially use an external tool. Boy, this is sounding way harder before I started talking out loud. But yeah, just as like it's upfront work or behind back end work, but I'm wondering which one's harder. I don't know.
Well, I mean, would this kind of go in line with like what was talked about earlier about like having that validator for Workbench? Is it that Mark and Joe were talking about?
Yeah, maybe.
They would go through and just know that that's a problem area and just have it double check it before. But of course, that would have to be a script. But
yeah, I think that's what I had in mind, is that you would, just like use whatever name you got, and in your CSV, and then run the validator against it. The validator will only tell you, I don't recognize that name, or worst case, if that name is the same as one that is in your vocabulary, it's gonna say, yes, I recognize that name, no problem. And and then introduce an error into your metadata because now you're linking to the wrong person, right? Because the name's matched up. I think a validator would help, but it may not help in every case, and it would just, at most, I think, flag that term is not in your vocabulary. Or
I mean, I guess you kind of get that out of the workbench log at this point already.
yeah,
in
if
a
you run
way.
check, you get that already. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, check is basically it does validation for you before you commit your CSV to Drupal. But it's slow. That is true.
But I wonder if that could be, like also just regular cleanup, not necessarily checking for the term, but just like, like comparing strings and seeing if it's close enough. Like, okay, well, this looks almost the same as that string. Like pop it off to something in a log or something like that. I don't know. Think
Yeah,
out loud.
It's a little dangerous names, but yeah, it'd be better if it would check the alternate names for matches. That would be, to me, a better solution.
You can, if you know that so earlier I mentioned that you could create a special view to query the vocabulary, and then you could make Workbench. I mean, we'd have to write this into Workbench, but you can make Workbench look at those. I'm just thinking out loud here. You do that query as like a pre-query, and then write a message to the log that says, I found this name as an alternate name for this term. Is that correct? I mean, something like that. Yeah, I mean, basically Workbench can communicate with Drupal using, like, in a read sense, like it can query Drupal and get back information using a view. So whatever you can write a view for, you can then introduce that capability into Workbench. I mean, so I think this is worth exploring. I just don't really know what the threshold of it being worth it is.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. But so if you want to open if you want to ping me on Slack, or you want to open an issue in the Workbench queue, we could continue the conversation there. Because I think it's probably a pretty common use case.
Even if we could get a view, instead of how to figure out how to do a view, maybe it would be helpful. Yeah.
The views are pretty straightforward.
Okay. Yeah, I haven't made one yet, so was my next thing to do.
Yeah, we've got views at SFU that do things like, well, one view that I document in the Workbench documentation is in the identify, let's say the field identifiers, the local identifier column, or identifier column, or sorry, a column field in your content type. If you want Workbench to skip a node, like creating a node, if a node with that with a unique identifier already exists, you can do that, like right now. And you do that by creating a view, simple view on your Drupal that exposes the field you want to check, like the unique identifier field, to that view. And then you register that view's URL in the Workbench configuration file. And you by doing that, you're telling Workbench, before you create the node in the current CSV row, query that view and see what you get back. If you get back using the value that you identify, the column you identify, like identifier, and if it gets something back with that supposedly unique identifier, it skips ingesting that row. If it doesn't get anything back, it assumes that record doesn't exist in Drupal, and it will ingest the node based on the content in that CSV row. So that's the kind of pattern I'm trying to describe.
Okay. Thank you, Mark.
I'm going a bit of a different direction. So that horrible line that I had highlighted in yellow about how term merge doesn't work with reference and typed relation fields. This is the line that's causing the problem. It's not in term merge, but it's in term reference change. And it's where they say the type of the field must be equal to entity reference for anything to happen. And our type of field is obviously not, but instead of using a get type, we could try to potentially say is class, and then use the entity reference class. And since we extend the entity reference field class, we should be a-okay with that. That's in theory anyway. It may be a lot less development than writing a whole new side of Workbench to do something like that. But that way you could just import some messy data if that's what you have, and then clean it up. It's generally, even if you've tried to clean it up already, you're going to be importing messy data. So this would allow you to clean it up a little bit more easily. All right. I guess we'll, are there any other questions? Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Rosie. That's amazing.
There aren't any other questions on taxonomies presentation. I think that that brings us to the end of our agenda. Is there something I've forgotten, Sarah?
I don't think so.
All right. Well, in that case, thank you everyone for coming, and thank you, Rosie, very much, and everyone in the interest groups and Noah for giving us the various updates. As we said earlier, we're going to not have open meetings in July and August. We'll see you again in September. So do let us know if there are particular topics you're interested in. Drop by the interest groups if those they send out reminder emails as well with what they're working on. Drop by there as well. There, as we said, soon will be an announcement about Islandora Con 2025. We would love folks to volunteer for that planning committee. And yeah, so in this forum, we'll see you in the fall, and in all the other forums, we'll see you soon. Thanks very much, everyone. Have a good rest of your day.